name is Robert Myers, and I'm the director of the Center for American Studies and Research here at the American University of Beirut, and I would like to welcome you all to the final lecture for this year. It's been an extraordinarily active and interesting year. I was just compiling them for a report. We've had 20 of them, and they've run the gamut. Thanks to all of you who've attended, and please tell people that we're planning a quite active, interesting, and somewhat different. We try to do something new next year series. Without further ado, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce Helen Samhan from the American Institute Foundation. She will give a talk this evening on politics and change, a century of Arab activism in the United States. And as always, we'll have questions afterwards. And fortunately, she can tell us, I hope, in the process, a great deal about her own career in this area, and we'll learn more about her and the important work that the Arab American Institute Foundation does in the process of the talk. So we welcome you and look forward to your talk and to speaking to you after.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be back at AUB, my alma mater. I was here in the 70s and did my graduate work here and got a degree in Middle East Studies when the program was brand new back in the early 70s. And so it's a delight to be invited back to my alma mater to speak about the work that I've been doing for the last 35 years. It's quite an interesting career, working on Arab American affairs, activism, integration, immigration, demographics. And as I was telling my staff before I left Washington, I'm so used to speaking to audiences in America about the Arab experience, and now this is kind of the flip, because I'm speaking to an audience in the Arab world about, in a sense, about the American experience. So it's really fun for me to be able to do that. Because the topic is so broad and it covers a century of our community's experience in the United States, I've tried to focus on a couple of areas that will give you a sense of the context and the context of the socio and political factors that have shaped the Arab experience in the United States, and also will give you a sense of the political integration or lack of integration that we have experienced in our 120 or some odd years of presence in the United States as an immigrant community. I have brought with me, prepared a slide presentation to accompany my presentation, and I've got some various graphics from things in my organization in our archives, as well as some from my family album to show you the very particular and personal experience of an Arab American family. So starting with the context of the socio and political factors that shaped our experience, we need to talk about the distinct immigration waves. And the first wave is one that most people in Lebanon are quite familiar with, and that's the pioneer wave, the wave that started in the 1880s, when Lebanese people from Greater Syria mostly Christians, started to emigrate into the United States as well as to other countries. And it was pretty intense migration patterns between 1880 and the early 1920s. It was very much a chain migration. Families, single men would go, and then they would come back and bring their families. There were a lot of reasons for the emigration from Lebanon and the rest of Greater Syria. There was economic hardship. There was famine. There was military conscription, especially that was opposed especially by the Christian minority. And so after the males started to emigrate to the United States, they went back and brought their families. And so what you find here, this is just a typical picture of an Arab immigrant family. This particular family is from Damascus, and they settled in Detroit. And this is an example of basically a complete family that would have left Damascus and gone to the United States. The immigrants who left the Arab world at that time mostly were concentrated in Greater Syria, the Ottoman province of Greater Syria. There were also some push factors. There were obviously the pull factors of a welcoming economy at the turn of the century in the United States. And so there were jobs, and there were also push factors. Some of the push factors were I guess it's both a push and a pull factor, and that would be the role of the missionaries in this part of the world. American missionaries who came, for example, those who founded AUB were originally American missionaries. So that missionary presence here really was one of the bridges that allowed some of the early immigrant families to go. There was also a lot of recruitment of immigrants from travel agents in the United States. They would actually send agents to Lebanon, to big cities, and they would say, we have lots of jobs for you, come to New York, come to Boston, come to Chicago. So many of the, I think I have another picture of another family also from Damascus, Syria, and again, you can see the multi-generations. And many of the immigrants who came were, these pictures, by the way, are dated in the 1890s, which is, by the way, when my family left Syria and Lebanon, was in the 1890s. So we are now in our fourth generation of being Americans of Arab descent. So many of the immigrants settled in large cities, the gateway cities, New York, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, and many of them, however, were pack peddlers. This is just a picture, an archival picture of a pack peddler who worked in the American heartland. Now, the pack peddler didn't have to have a lot of capital. He usually had connections with family or people from his village, and he was able to borrow on credit, and he was able to really make a living without a lot of capital. And this was something that a lot of the Arab immigrants of this generation were able to prosper in that period, because they were able to move around the country without much capital. They were able to, they began as pack peddlers, and then many of them opened up small stores, usually drive-in stores, and it also, the pack peddling phenomenon among Arab immigrants also allowed the immigration to be quite mobile. They spread out throughout the United States. There are Arab communities in virtually every county in the United States because of that, largely because of that original experience of pack peddling. There were, however, some colonies, and this has the Syrian colony in New York City. New York City was the mother colony for this generation. It was the place where you had you had the banks, the Arabic newspapers, you had import-export businesses and others, and so New York really was the first place that many Arab immigrants would go, and then they would spread out from there. This happened to have appeared, by the way, almost as a cartoon in a local New York paper. And I don't know if you can read what's written underneath. It says, the foreign element in New York, the Syrian colony, Washington Street. And so obviously the foreign element, the foreignness was the first thing that people would notice. The other thing this is an example of one of the newspapers that was founded at the turn of the century. This was founded in 1898. It happened to be founded by my family, my mother's family, the McCarsel family. And this is the very first edition of Al-Huda, one of the early Arabic language dailies that was published in the United States. It started in Philadelphia in 1898, moved to New York in 1904, and it stayed in our family until the early 1970s, when it was sold, and then it finally closed in the 1990s. So it almost reached a century of publishing history. So now what happened, however, at the turn of the century was, while there was economic opportunity for the immigrants, there was also a lot of conflicting political attitudes about these new immigrants. Because earlier, the immigrant wave that was predominant in the 19th century was mostly from Northern Europe. What happened at the turn of the century is the places where the immigrants were coming from really shifted to Eastern Europe and shifted to the Mediterranean countries. So you had a lot more people from the Syrians, the Greeks, the Poles, the Italians. So the Southern European, the Mediterranean area, and Eastern Europeans, Russians. A lot of Russians came at this time as well. And so the early about the physical, cultural, linguistic characteristics of this immigrant wave. And of course, the Arab immigrants were probably the most foreign of all of the immigrants because they were really the first non-European wave of immigrants that came at that time. So what happened is you had a climate at the turn of the century that was quite nativistic. It was xenophobic. There was a lot of xenophobia. So you had this conflict. You had the economy wanting new immigrants coming in to kind of build America, but then you had this fear of what the new immigrants were bringing with them. There was an intense climate of Americanization at that time. When immigrants would come to the United States, there was not a respect for diversity and a respect for customs and language, and there was really a sense that you're coming to our country, you have to become an American, you should look like us, you should sound like us, and many Arabic families who came at that time Americanized their name and anglicized their name. So that's why you have now so many of the descendants of the early wave of Arab immigrants whose names are, Thomas and Abraham, and they are Arabic names that have been translated in many cases into the English version of the names. There was, and I already talked about the high mobility. One of the things that the high mobility allowed for, however, was there weren't too many concentrations of Arab immigrants in one place. So the Arab immigrants were quite spread out. It inhibited, to some extent, political activity as a constituency. It didn't inhibit becoming American citizens. It didn't inhibit voting or being part of the process, but it did inhibit the sense of a community of coming together and voting as an ethnic community. The first real crisis that faced the Arab immigrants was one that happened in the first decade of the 20th century, and it was called the Yellow Race Crisis at the time. And the reason it was called that was it was judges who were responsible for processing naturalization applications for the Syrian immigrants started to deny them. The first case, I think, was in 1909. It was in a case in Ohio. There was another case in Georgia. And what happened is that some of the judges, given the climate I was talking about, the xenophobic climate, they would look at the person before them and their name and everything, and they would say, wait a minute, in order to be an American citizen, you have to be white, Caucasian. And they would look at, some of these immigrants, and they would be swarthy, and they would have big mustaches, and they probably talk with a very thick accent, and they say, this applicant is not white. And sometimes it was just by looking at the person, but some of the judges also took it a step further, and they would say, well, wait a second, this applicant, it has a Turkish passport. Of course, they all had Turkish passports at that time because they were subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Turkey is in Asia. Therefore, these applicants are Asian, and they are not allowed to become citizens. There was an Asian Exclusion Act in place since the 1880s. Asians were not permitted to become citizens of the United States at that time. You had to be either white or black, and you could not be Asian. So the Yellow Race Crisis, is what it was called at the time, really was the first time that they had to kind of present themselves as a constituency and as a community. So the leaders of the community got together, including people like my great uncle and my grandfather, and others who were educated to basically make the case for the fact that Syrians were Caucasian. And it was quite an interesting couple of years. There were articles in the newspaper. They would make arguments about, we come from the Holy Land. Jesus Christ was from the same area that we were from. If he's the one who has founded the religion upon which most Americans are based, then how could you say that we who are his brothers and cousins are not considered white and eligible for citizenship? So it went back and forth in the courts. Finally, the Bureau of Naturalization and Immigration did, in fact, decree that people from areas in Western Asia, that as long as they were not from places from the Indian subcontinent east, that was where they drew the line. So anyone who came from any place that was basically west of the Indian subcontinent going to come back, by the way. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So what happens in this, so this was finally put to rest in 1917. What happens in the build-up to World War I is that there were other forces that were really coming down politically on the immigration, the immigration flow. There were about 20,000 immigrants from the Arab world, from the greater Syria at that time, that were coming every year. But they were also coming from these other places. What happened in 1924 is Congress passed what they called the National Origins Act, and it decided that it was going to limit, they put quotas on immigration from, based on the presence, on the census from, I believe it was the 1910 census. Whatever 2% of that population would be permitted to come into the country. So obviously, it was a way to favor Northern European immigrants because most of the immigrants at that time were from Northern Europe. And so anyone who came from the smaller countries and the more recent countries was limited. So for all intents and purposes, immigration pretty much ground to a halt between the years 1924 and 1965. There was very, very little new immigration. And what happened is that those were the decades where it was the coming of age of the first American-born generation of the immigrant children. This is a family portrait. This is my mother's family in Cranford, New Jersey, in 1920. This is an example of the first American-born generation, the 5 daughters of Southern Mukarzal. This was the time in the 1920s when a lot of attention was put on this generation because there weren't a lot of new immigrants coming in. We started to have the English language publications and institutions. We switched from Arabic only to Arabic and English, and then in the 30s and 40s it started to be more and more English because you didn't have a lot of new people coming in who could read Arabic. Some of the older people could still read Arabic, but the younger people were not learning Arabic. So this was a really interesting transition time in the development of the community. There was, however, some political activism. This is a very fun story that I happened to find in my aunt's archives, and it was an article from Laredo, Texas, 1938, as you can see, and the lead says the 3 musketeers of the bar of Laredo, Texas, and they're all Lebanese young men who were all lawyers. The Kazan brothers are now famous in Texas. The family has been there for many, many decades. And one of the interesting things about this story is they talk about the 3 brothers, the 3 musketeers. They're all lawyers. They have a law firm, Kazan, and Kazan, which you can imagine was very common at that time. And in the final paragraph it says, oh, and there's a young Abe, who is an up-and-coming young law student, and he's going to go far. Well, it turns out that Abe Kazan was the first Arab American to be elected to the U.S. Congress in 1956. So this was kind of an interesting foretelling of the political activity of individual Arab Americans. What happened in the years leading up to World War II was, this is another family photo. This is my dad when he was at an officer's training school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. World War II, the reason I have this photo is to impress upon everybody the importance of the Second World War in the civic identity and integration of the Arab American community of that time. World War II made a tremendous impact on becoming American, feeling American, being part of the American war effort. And it wasn't just the Arab immigrants; it was everybody. It was a huge impact. It really had a huge impact on most of the children of that wave of immigrants at the turn of the century, and they all really had an opportunity through the war effort to really feel part of the American experience. And there were also the other benefits of being in the military after the war. There's the GI Bill, and there were veteran loans. A lot of veterans, and by the way, a lot of the children of the Syrian immigrants served in the military, and they were taking advantage of these GI loans and veteran loans as well. So it helped really promote a kind of a middle class in the Syrian and Lebanese and Syrian community. There's more mobility out of some of the cities into the suburbs. There's this kind And what happened, of course, in the 1950s after the war was raising the third generation of, my brother is shaking his head because this is our family picture in 1955, and I didn't mean to embarrass him, but but this is an example of the third generation of the Syrian and Lebanese immigrants, very typical kind of middle-class American experiences. We lived in Englewood, New Jersey at the time when this picture was taken. And so this is a very common experience of that immigration wave, of that generation. What happened in the 1960s is that it was really a turning point for many reasons. It was a turning point because of politics and also because of the new wave of immigration. The change in the immigration laws occurred in 1965. After World War II, I think the American government started to rethink those quotas, limiting immigration, and they realized that there was an economic boom after the war. They actually needed more people, and they could absorb more immigrants. So the major immigration overhaul happened in 1965, and it opened up immigration to a lot of places around the world, not just the entire Arab world, which it did, but also Asia, Africa, South America. That's when the really major wave of new immigrants started, was in the mid-1960s. And so what was happening is that when the laws were changing, the sending populations were also changing. So what had happened in those intervening years between the 20s and the 60s was that the Ottoman Empire was defeated. There was colonial rule, and then there was post-colonial independence in most of the Arab world. And so that experience of kind of Arab nationalism and Arab identity and national identity really changed the attitudes of the immigrants that came in the 1960s. Some of them came for to escape political conflict. Some of them came for economic reasons. Some of them came because their new countries were nationalizing property, and so you had people who were landowners and whose property was being nationalized and they wanted to leave, like in Syria and Egypt. So there were all sorts of reasons why people left in the 60s and 70s, and some were refugees. There were quite a few Palestinian refugees who came at that time, and then moving into the 1980s, there were Lebanese refugees and Yemeni refugees, and now, of course, the 21st century refugees, like from Iraq, Sudan, Somalia. So we've had a kind of a flow of refugees over the last half decade. So here's just a slide, and this is just a Hafli in Chicago. It shows a Palestinian women, Palestinian family in Chicago, and this is kind of it just gives you a profile of the new immigrant, especially the immigrants from villages in the Arab world, and that they were able to really retain, in many ways, a lot of their own cultural habits. Many of the new immigrants who came in the 1960s were Muslim, whereas the predominant wave in the first wave were Christian. So you had a real diversity, a religious diversity, and the fact that these immigrants were Muslim, most of them, meant that their acculturation challenges were greater than the Christian immigrants. So the Christian immigrants arrived, they were entering a quote-unquote Christian country, and their institutions might have been a little bit different. They had Eastern churches versus Western churches, but they were still Christian, and there was not that sense of real difference in religious practices and religious requirements. So the fact that so many of this new immigration wave were Muslim really does change the way that the integration happens. The other thing is that obviously the 67 war was a real turning point in terms of the political visibility of the Arab community in the United States. It was the time when the popular and political culture of the United States was decidedly pro-Israel. We bought the Israel argument, the Israel narrative of the 67 war. And so here you had this community, both second generation or third generation from the first wave, and then first generation from the new wave, who were faced with this political crisis in the Arab world and this catastrophe, and living in a country that was totally denying the reality that they knew, the reality that they this was quite traumatic for many, many Arab immigrants living through the 1960s and the 70s. And so what happened is that this kind of unilateral narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict created a lot of political stereotypes, a lot of cultural stereotypes, and we'll see those a little bit later. There was an emergence of a pro-Palestinian voice in the 1960s and 70s. It was small, but it was valiant. You know, it made an effort. There were organizations that started to try to counter the kind of unilateral voice of the pro-Israel community. And what happened is, well, we were obviously, I say because I was working for American organizations back then, and we were obviously no match for the pro-Israel narrative. But and what happened is that because they had the means and the credibility, they were able to very successfully, in most cases, to discredit the pro-Palestinian voice in the United States. They were very, very successful in painting all activity that was pro-Palestinian as terrorist. It's kind of like it is now, but back then it was just so slightly different. But it was, it was anyone who supported Palestinian rights was considered, supporting terrorism. And it even went further than that. There was the political narrative in the United States got to the point where if you were supporting an Arab position, whether it was Palestinian or any other Arab position, you were kind of painted as an enemy of the United States. Because you were painted as an enemy of the Israeli position, and by virtue of the narrative, you were kind of painted as an enemy of the United States. So here we were, Americans, both first, second, third, fourth generation, living in the United States, supporting a political position, and yet we were being portrayed as enemies of our own country. And this, I think, this portraying Arab issues this way, it really got worse. It had political roots, but it also had economic roots. So you had in the 1970s the oil embargo, and that created an economic stereotype that was just added to the political one. So you had terrorism and oil states destroying the economy of the United States. It was like a double whammy. So you had a lot of caricatures at that time, and this is just a few examples of them. I remember this one very well, to save oil on high-cost fuels burn sheiks. This was actually a product that was created in the 1970s, and it was the kind of thing like mazout. You put it in a stove to burn. They actually named their product sheiks, so they were able to actually have this very inflammatory, if you'll excuse the pun, inflammatory advertising campaign. And I remember I worked at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee at the time, and that was one of our first campaigns, was to say, oh, come on, you've got to be kidding. And they said, well, no, we're not, this guy's not being burned. He's just standing on top of the flames. Yeah. It's like, oh, really? Okay. And then here's the other anti-OPEC image where it says, remember the days when you had a tiger in your tank. And of course now it's another animal, actually it's a pig, which is a double insult with a kafia. So you had this ongoing sense of the Arabs are just the enemies of the United States in both ways, politically and economically. And this anti-Arab narrative kind of seeped into popular culture as well. And I know in my work and in my experience, we have been fighting, I think, for 30 years now, what I would call the demonization of the Arab culture in the United States. I mean, it's being presented that everything about Arab culture somehow has been polluted by political realities or by, Islam or Islamic extremism or whatever you want to call it, or terrorism. It's very, very hard to depoliticize Arab culture in the United States. I can remember times when we would have, there would be a cultural day on campus, on a campus, and they would have International Day, and they would have booths, and sometimes there would be objections to having a booth, like a Palestinian booth or a Lebanese booth or something, because why? Because that was considered political. I mean, just virtually, the virtual country having any kind of presentation of their culture was considered political. So what happened in this environment is that the organization I now work for, the Arab American Institute, decided it was time to take our political work a little bit in a different direction, and that was to really to really learn the process of American politics and integrate our community in the very local work of American politics and try to plant some roots there and take advantage of the constituency that we have. We organized AAI in 1985, and it was really a turning point because prior to that, Arab American politics was very much focused on foreign policy. And what we were trying to do was to take it in a different direction and say that most American politics has roots in county, state, city elections. I mean, it's not all about foreign policy. You have to know the political community first before you start talking about foreign policy. So it was our job to kind of take politics and make it much more approachable and reachable. So our goals were to educate Arab American voters, to register them to vote, to talk about the issues that were up for in a given election, and to raise our issues in the context of American electoral politics. In 1988, we launched a very ambitious campaign. It was called Palestine Statehood Now. It was at the time when statehood for Palestinians was not very popular. It was not addressed by either political party. But because Jesse Jackson was running for president that year, he also ran in '84, but because he was running in '88 and he was progressive and he had a rainbow coalition, and the progressive Arab Americans were part of that rainbow coalition, they actually agreed to take on this hot button issue. And so it was part of the Jackson platform was to have statehood for Palestinians. And it was here, I think I have an example. This is Jim Zogby, my friend and colleague, who's the president of AAI, and he's kind of the originator of this campaign. And what we did was we took the issue of Palestine statehood and we took it to the floor of the Democratic Convention. And it was quite interesting because we were able to get in party politics, delegates are asked to endorse various platforms. So we took our Palestine statehood platform around to the delegates, and we got over 1,000 delegates to sign the platform. It ended up there was a lot of negotiations before it came to the floor of the convention because Dukakis was running at the time, he was the candidate, and Jackson and Dukakis kept caucusing about this, and Dukakis was afraid it was going to bring down the convention. He was afraid that it was going to split it apart and that it would be absolutely impossible to get it back. And so they came up with a compromise and they said, okay, we are not going to take a vote on this amendment, on this platform plank, but we will debate it. And so they had a debate on the floor of the convention, but they did not take a vote. It was the first time in American history that the issue of Palestinian statehood was actually debated in an American convention. And this really started a trend of raising issues of Palestinian rights and other hot-button issues in American conventions. Here's an example of this is an illegal poster by banner. They were not allowed. These were some Palestinian American delegates who were really not allowed to have a banner, and they did it anyway. So it's just to show you, in 1992 they were kind of breaking the democratic policy. But what happened is that this coalition of working with other progressive Democrats really helped forge a lot of alliances, particularly with American minorities. I have a slide here that shows a march that we participated in 1993. This was the Rainbow Coalition March for Justice and Peace, and this was our delegation supporting that march. And those alliances have really stayed. They have not been totally consistent. Sometimes they've gone up and down depending on the political mood, but they have been a really important foundation. And what happened by the mid-1990s is there were other alliances that were being formed with American political constituencies, and that really centered around the re-election campaign of Bill Clinton. He was looking at the polls, and he was looking at the fact that the Democratic Party was losing the so-called Reagan Democrats, the blue-collar, ethnic, Catholic voters who used to be Democrats, and they supported Reagan, and the Democratic Party really never got them back. So he decided, or the party decided, that they were going to do specific outreach to ethnics, to American ethnics, to poll Jews, and well, they don't have to do too much outreach because Jews are very supportive Democrats, but Hungarians and Armenians and Arabs. And this ethnic coalition effort really was a new thing in ethnic politics, because the Democratic Party was putting a little bit of money and organizing around the development of ethnic Democrats to come back to the Democratic Party. And it's been interesting. I think it helped Bill Clinton get reelected in '96. It obviously did not help Al Gore in 2000, but it created an institution in the Democratic Party. There is now called the National Democratic Ethnic Coordinating Council, and the co-chair of that is Jim Zogby, who is the president of AAI. So there's a really strong Arab American presence in this ethnic revival in the Democratic Party. One of the programs that we started at AAI to really Americanize and brand an Arab American electoral participation was a program we called Yalla Vote. And we started it in the I guess it was in the mid-1990s, and we decided we wanted to brand a program that would be registering voters and getting information about candidates and getting people to the polls, get out the vote. That was like the main purpose. And so we called it Yalla Vote, and I think I have a picture of the logo here. These are some volunteers in Michigan in 2005 or 2004 actually. You can see the logo there. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's written in Arabic and in English. And aside from the fact that we apparently spelled it wrong, that's one of the things that Arab scholars have told us. That's not how you spell Yalla. But anyway, we didn't know. We asked our printer, who was Arabic speaking, to help us with the design, and found out he was wrong. But anyway, we had a very red, white, and blue effort. This is all American, but it's also all Arab American. And so this has been a very successful campaign that we've been running for the last 15 years. And as you can see, the slogan is organize, register, and vote, and that's exactly what we try to do. In the 2008 presidential election, our Yalla Vote campaign took a slightly different turn. We decided to try something new in our Get Out the Vote efforts, and we decided to have a virtual phone bank. This was something that most organizations had not tried yet, but we collaborated with a Latino organization called the NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. And they had a wonderful program whereby people could go to get on a computer, and actually you could put in voter lists, and it would pull up one record at a time, and you could actually make a call reminding that person to vote. So what we decided to do was take it one step further and make it a virtual phone bank. So we would give the password to our volunteers all around the country, say, if you can just make 20 calls tonight or 40 calls tomorrow, here's the password, go on in and just call these people. And it was successful. It is something that I think we're going to be doing again. Now, from the more positive aspect of getting involved in American politics, there's obviously always the downside of American politics and of being Arab in American politics. And that has to do with Arab baiting, which is obviously when your ethnicity is used against you in an election to either somehow it's a liability. So a couple of examples of Arab baiting, and it happens in both parties. No one party, neither the Democrats or the Republicans are exempt from this. It just talks. It does say, however, how deep some of these anti-Arab stereotypes and negative stereotypes are. So there's a Lebanese-born fellow named Joe Khoury who ran for Congress in California in the 1990s, and his opponent decided to run an ad against him, and all he did was publish the names of Joe Khoury's Arab American supporters. He just had this long list because Joe Khoury was running for Congress. Not too many people run for Congress, so he was able to raise money around the country. So everybody's name who was Arabic was printed in long columns, and that's all he did. He said, look who is supporting Joe Khoury. So it might have been my name or my father's name or my uncle's name. It doesn't matter. We're American citizens. We have every right to support him, but it was just the fact that we had Arabic names was enough to discredit him. I don't know if that's the only reason he lost, but he lost. Spencer Abraham, who actually was a U.S. Senator and became Lebanese American. When he was running for re-election in 2000, there was a group called FAIR, and it's the opposite of what it says. Re-election also, but again, I don't know if it's tied to the negative ads. He actually went on to become Secretary of Energy, so it was not bad, but it's just an example. There's another race that happened in Jacksonville, Florida. A Lebanese American mayor, whose name is Tom Hazouri, was running for re-election. And one day he woke up and he found out that these campaign handbills had been put on cars in Jacksonville, and this is what it looked like. It said, "Wanted Saddam Hazouri, dead or alive." This was when Saddam Hussein was still alive. And it says preferably dead, and it's for crimes against the people of Duval County. And anyway, obviously people did not like Mayor Hazouri. But what's so interesting is it's conflated. I mean, they have like Nazi things on his collar, and he has a mustache to make him look sort of like Saddam Hussein. And of course, he's called Saddam Hazouri. So it's really hard to know. He also lost his election. He lost it by 0.6% of the vote. There's been other examples of indirect. That would be direct when someone's of Arab descent. There's also indirect Arab baiting when someone has supporters in the Arab community, or he takes a position that is maybe countervailing the countervailing position of the pro-Israel narrative. And the pro-Israel community and PACs are really strong, and they basically can punish people if they take positions that are not considered the party line. And so this is mostly apparent in congressional and Senate races. And it became pretty well known that after Charles Percy was targeted in 1984 and he lost his Senate race, all they have to do is say, "Remember Charles Percy? Do you want that to happen to you?" And there was like a loyalty oath, not really an oath, but there was literally a paper that congressional candidates were asked to sign. This was really strong in the 1980s and the early 1990s. Candidates would be given a position paper by AIPAC and say, would you sign this? Because we will support you if you sign it, and if you don't sign it, we will try to defeat you. I mean, it was pretty blatant. So this was very, very common in the 1980s and the 1990s, and it was particularly common with black candidates. And I think because African American candidates tended to have more progressive positions on Middle East peace issues. Jesse Jackson certainly did. And so they often became a target of these things. There was a tempering of this Arab baiting in the mid-1990s during the Oslo Accords. Then 9/11 made it spurt up again. We really were on a good trajectory, but then 9/11 brought back all the negative Arab stereotypes and the fear and the Islamophobia came back after 9/11, and so this hyper-focus on national security has allowed opponents to use all sorts of fear in their messaging. And so what happened let's say, for example, in the 2008 elections, there was a lot. You all followed the presidential elections, I'm sure, and so you know and you remember all the messaging about Obama's Muslim roots, and he's a closet Muslim, and we really don't know enough about him, and the famous remark at the McCain rally about the woman saying, "I don't trust him because he's an Arab," and McCain was kind of stuck saying, "No, ma'am, he's not an Arab," as if he has to kind of apologize for that. But there was a lot of baiting of Obama for that, and here's just an example of a thing that was circulating on the web with Obama's famous iconic poster in an Arab headdress. And then there were other issues of Muslim baiting, mostly Muslim baiting in 2008. I don't know if you've heard about Keith Ellison, who's the first Muslim American to be elected to the U.S. Congress. Keith Ellison, when he was sworn in January of 2009, he made headlines because he wanted to be sworn in on the Quran. And he just had the most brilliant public relations move. He decided he would borrow Thomas Jefferson's Quran and use that as what he would take his oath on. And that's what he did. Here's a picture of taking his oath on Thomas Jefferson's Quran, and he basically, he would not back down. He would not, he basically said, look, if Thomas Jefferson can read and respect the Quran, then you can too. So that's just an example of that. In spite of this, in spite of the Arab baiting and the problems of being in our ethnic community, there are a lot of Arab Americans who run and win office and who serve very well their constituencies. And they've actually been very, very useful in a number of policy arenas. The Arab Americans now who are in federal office in the U.S. Congress, there's only a few, and they don't always agree with our positions, our kind of progressive positions on everything, but they've proved to be very helpful in a number of areas. We have, for example, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Lebanese American Ray LaHood, and Ray has been he has served in Congress for many, many terms, and he's a little conservative. He's Republican, and he has not always agreed with the Arab kind of political opinion, Arab American political opinions. When the resolutions come up every year in Congress about moving the embassy, the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, every year it comes up. He has voted for that resolution a couple of times, and so he always gets our kind of rankles. We get rankled about that because we don't think that's a good position. But then what happened is after 9/11, he happened to be sitting on the Transportation Committee, and he was actually in the senior position on the Transportation Committee. And the first person to offer to hold hearings about airline profiling was Ray LaHood. I mean, he understood that there were certain things he needed to take a stand on. And then there were other instances where we have benefited from the work of Arab Americans in Congress. Here's an example of these are three of the sitting Arab Americans now. Nick Rahal at the microphone, Darrell Issa behind him, and then George Salem, who is our chairman, but then next to him is Charles Bustani from Louisiana. Darrell Issa is from Southern California. Nick Rahal is from West Virginia. These are the three Arab American members of the U.S. House. And there have been, and particularly in the Israeli war against the Lebanese War of 2006, all three of these, and two of them, by the way, are Republican, and Nick Rahal is a Democrat, and all of them were very, very strong about making sure to get the position that we had to basically help the Lebanese. There needed to be humanitarian support. The position of not having a U.S. position was unacceptable. So these members of Congress turned out to be very supportive. There was and right around that time of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006, we put together an ad in the Washington Post, and it was a humanitarian ad, call for a ceasefire, and it was just around the time when the U.S. government was not saying anything, and Condoleezza Rice was just basically silent on the question of the attacks, and we got some celebrities, some Arab American celebrities, to put their picture on this ad. So you see Paul Anka and Kathy Najmy, Casey Kasem, and Wendy Malik. These are all actors. And Tony Shalhoub, you can see there. Well, on the list of names there's the name of Ilyas Zerhouni. Ilyas Zerhouni is actually a member of the president's cabinet. He's Algerian American. He was the director of NIH, and he agreed to put his name in his personal capacity. It caused a huge flare-up in the administration because he is a member of the cabinet. He was taking a position against his own president, and he refused to take his name off. I mean, he left it on there, which I think is another example. They say blood's thicker than water. I mean, in some cases, the compassion and the empathy that people who have either lived in the Arab world or respect the Arab world and know it, sometimes they're willing to stick their neck out politically, and this is an example of that. Now I need to talk about the sea change that happened after 9/11. I can talk for months about what happened in the United States after 9/11, and I'll try, however, to just encapsulate it. And because I think you've all read about it, heard about it, saw it happen. Obviously, there was immediate experiences of backlash in some communities. challenges to the patriotism of Arabs and Muslims, but there was also a lot of sympathy in the United States, where neighbors would help neighbors if they thought that they were going to be harmed, that they would be the first people to go and help them. The mood among Arab Americans was uber American at that point. Everybody was putting out flags. People who never owned an American flag got an American flag at that point. And this was a business owner in Detroit who just bought that flag. You can even see the folds in it. It was something that it was like protection against the backlash. We are American too. Look, don't attack us. Don't hurt me or my family. There was obviously policies about tightening security that affected the Arabs and Muslims who were living in the United States or visiting the United States. There was a lot of questions, suspicion of loyalty, etc. We tried to deal with some of this by working with like-minded organizations and even some celebrities to kind of counter the messaging. So we put out this public service announcement, which was called "Americans Stand United." It was quite a beautiful saying that was basically against hate, and it was shown on various. It was actually adopted by Stars Encore, which is a movie conglomerate, and they put it on all of their networks that they show Stars movies. It was picked up by the Ad Council, so this was something that was really helpful. This was in the early months after 9/11, and the atmosphere after 9/11 also had an impetus in a different way. This group of Arab American Marines was organized by the man in the middle, whose name is Jamal Badani. He's a gunnery sergeant in the U.S. Marines. He formed an organization right after 9/11 called the Association of Patriotic Arab Americans in the Military, APAM. They had never organized before, and he was able to discover that there's over 3,000 service people of Arab descent in the military, active service. And he decided, I've got to do something about this. And what the immediate impetus of forming this organization, excuse me, was he got a call from his uncle in Dearborn, Michigan, who owned a store, and he said, "Jamal, can you send me a picture of yourself in your uniform? I want to put it on my counter." And he said, "Okay, well, sure, I'll send it to you." And it occurred to him that his service was something that his uncle wanted to display as something he was very proud of. And it started Jamal thinking, he said, "You know what, I need to do something." So he became much more active. He now speaks out on anything that involves Arab Americans in the military. And there was a lot that happened in the years after 9/11 that affected American policy. We lost a lot of our constitutional protections that were put in place in the 1970s. The Patriot Act is infamous at this point, and it has been something that has created a magnet of attention and concern for Arab American organizations, people who care about constitutional rights, civil liberties organizations, etc. So obviously we've been very, very busy. But there's also been an interesting flip side to some of these government programs and policies, and that is it's almost been a good cop, bad cop situation where you have the bad cop doing the surveillance and the investigations and the whatever to where they go to mosques and they start to interview people. Then you have people in the Civil Rights Division who are actually protecting against hate crimes and prosecuting hate crimes and dealing with employment discrimination. So it was really interesting. We were seeing two sides of the same agencies really dealing with us in a very different way. One, we were sort of targeted, and the other one, we were protected. So and that has not changed, by the way. That really does continue. This chart was based on some surveys that we did in 2002, asking people about where they felt discriminated against. This was a survey of Arab Americans, a national random sample survey, and we found that most of the blue line says in the past, prior to 9/11, and since 9/11 is in red, and we were really kind of encouraged to see that harassment in schools had gone down after 9/11, and I think that's because built party relationships with both the Democratic and Republican parties, and they were very quick to support us and to say, we're not going to stay away from your community. We want to be there. It just so happens that there were governor's races in both New Jersey and Virginia in September of 2011. In November of 2011, and we were having candidate forums both in New Jersey and in Virginia for the candidates for governor. And they were in the third week of September after 9/11. And we thought for sure that they would not want to come after all of what was going on. And all four of the candidates in New Jersey, the two in New Jersey and the two in Virginia, said, no, absolutely, we are coming. We want to come. We want to be there. We want to support your community. So I thought that was really amazing, actually, that political figures, the two people that ultimately became the governors of New Jersey and Virginia were there at, speaking to our community at that time. And I think the other kind of secret weapon maybe that we have as a community is that the federal government is really recruiting us. They're doing a lot of outreach programs. They need people who understand Arab culture and speak Arabic and other Middle Eastern languages. And so there's tons of recruitment programs going on, trying to recruit people of Arab descent to be in the intelligence community, in the military, linguists, and et cetera. Now, not everybody agrees with that recruitment, but it's definitely kind of defining a different relationship. And also, as we have seen when President Obama had his famous speech in Cairo, he considers the Arab and Muslim communities in the United States as really important bridges between America and the Muslim and Arab world. And so that's another thing that I can say from experience that the Obama administration has really reached out to us in quite an impressive way. We've had 4 leadership meetings already with President Obama. We didn't have any leadership meetings under President Bush for 8 years, and so there was a palpable difference in the approach to Arabs and Muslims in the United States. I want to quickly go through a little bit of a demographic profile just to show you a little bit about who we are as a political constituency. This is a census map of where we are in the various counties across the country. You can see the biggest concentrations are in expected places: Houston, Southern California, Southern Florida, et cetera, and Michigan. We estimate that we're about 3.5 to 4 million people. It's more than what the Census Bureau estimates, and there's other reasons for that. And we're pretty much concentrated in a third of our community live in 3 states: California, Michigan, and New York. This is how we break down by primary identity. So on the census, there's a question: what are you? And people will say they will write in these various origins. And the largest being the Lebanese is now pretty much one third of the population. The Moroccan and Somali communities are recent communities. They were not there 10 years ago. The Syrians are a large community. The Egyptians are now the second largest community, actually, in the United States. Arab or Arabic means that they identify only as generically Arab, not as any one country. And then other Arab means smaller countries like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, etc. And then let's see, what do we have here? This is the religious affiliation. About 3/4 are of some Christian affiliation. About 1/4 is Muslim. And this is kind of the breakout based on our private surveys, because the census doesn't ask religious affiliation. In terms of the other data we get from the U.S. Census, the education levels of Arab Americans in the aggregate is very high. We have about 40% of bachelor's and higher degree versus about 28% of all Americans. We also tend to be more in the private sector. I think it's 88% of Arab Americans are employed in the private sector. Many have their own businesses, and let's put it this way: Arab Americans are not farmers and they're not miners for the most part. Then when we did a survey, I should say Zogby International, which is owned by our board member John Zogby, did a very interesting survey in 2000 comparing ethnic communities in the United States about their political participation. So this progressive liberal, very liberal, liberal, moderate, conservative, very conservative. And these were the 6 ethnic communities, ethnic/religious/racial communities. So he polled Italians and blacks, Hispanics, Jews, Asians, and Arabs. And these were the answers that were given by the respondents. And Arabs are the most conservative of all of these ethnic communities, which I find it's not really surprising to me that I've worked with this data for a long time. It's surprising to some people, though, how conservative the Arab community is. When it comes to issue priorities, when they were asked in 2000 what were the dominant issues that would make a difference in their voting for president, the foreign policy issues were very strong. By the time 2008 came along, when we did surveys, they had pretty much matched the American electorate by saying jobs and the economy were very important as the most important issue, and then the Iraq War was the next most important issue. Let me see if I have another slide here. This is party political affiliation, and you can see how it's shifted since 1996. Used to be in 96 and 2000, it was Democrats and Republicans were pretty much the same, and it started, and the Republicans lost ground, and the Democrats gained ground over those next ensuing years. So by 2008, something like 70% of Arab Americans that we polled voted for President Obama. So it's kind of interesting. You've got that conservative ideology, but when it comes to presidential preference, Bush had a lot of support, by the way, in 2000. He was supported by 57% of Arab Americans, which means many Democrats voted for president for the first Bush term. By the second Bush term, after 9/11 and all the policies, he lost the support of many people in the Arab community. So that's what we see. The other thing I think, to be fair, about the 2008 elections is that the Obama campaign really did a lot of outreach to various ethnic and minority communities. He had a committee for virtually every ethnic community in the United States. There was a page on his website, and you could go there and you could get materials, and he had buttons and everything. And so I think I have a picture here of the logo that was on the website, Arab Americans for Obama. This was one of the first times it was publicly, and we talked about Arab baiting and people wanting to stay away from their Arab supporters. This was one of the first presidential candidate campaigns that really said, no, we're going to treat you like everybody else. And this is a picture of Jim Zogby with candidate Obama back before the election. So I guess in conclusion, it's obvious that the various immigration waves have created some very interesting dynamics over the decades. There have been really strong political and social forces that affected the first immigrant wave, and then very different ones that affected the second immigrant wave. The other thing is that we have some very interesting trends in our community. We are not monolithic. We are very diverse, politically diverse, as well as primary identification, and our ideology is also quite diverse. We don't agree on all issues. There are a few consensus issues that AAI works on, because we know that Arab Americans have very different views on healthcare, and they have very different views on even on something like immigration policy. But there are certain very visceral issues that deal with Palestinian rights and Lebanese rights and things like that are very, very strongly consensus issues, and so we tend to work on those. And that the importance of the political climate of 9/11 cannot be underestimated. It was both, it allowed a lot of teaching moments where we as a community could kind of rise up and be there to speak about our culture and our heritage and to kind of correct the stereotypes. But it's still an environment, a political environment, where racial profiling is still there. It's something that we have to be very vigilant about. I just want to close with an anecdote that you probably read about because you're in Lebanon, and that is this Miss USA beauty pageant. I don't know if you all read about that, but it's hysterical that a beauty pageant would have created such a political backlash on the internet, and it did. Rima Fakir, a Lebanese-born beautiful woman from Michigan, was crowned Miss USA a week ago, and some of the right-wing blogs blogs that are known to be, anti-Arab anyway, they started creating the most unbelievable connections because she's Shia from the south. She must have a connection to Hezbollah. And all of a sudden, there was this, on Google, if you put Rima Fakih, the next word that came is Hezbollah. Everybody was talking about Rima Fakih and Hezbollah and Hezbollah and Hezbollah. The one I think I get the biggest kick out of is Steve Emerson, who is infamous in our circles for being a quote-unquote terrorism expert. Well, Steve Emerson put a press release out the day after she was crowned with an analysis about the dangerous trends of Muslim beauty queens in the West. And the danger comes from the appeasement that he thinks Western society is applying to Arab and Muslim women in these beauty pageants. And it just boggles the mind. I mean, if you read the headlines about scarves, headscarves, and veils and everything, and you think that he could have concluded that beauty pageants, which are the most un-Islamic thing ever, and it boggles the mind. He should just get over the fact that Muslim women happen to be very beautiful. With that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention.
Let me take the opportunity to thank you for a wonderful talk. And I have two questions. One has to do with whether or not you think this is a permanent shift to the Democratic Party. There is every reason in the 1990s, for example, with Bush Sr. to think that a lot of people were quite at home in the Republican Party. And as you said, a lot of cultural conservatism. The other question that I'm interested in is why do you think that Arab Americans were tagged with this label of terrorism, and it never stuck with Irish Americans, for example? I mean, there was certainly in Great Britain, I would have conversations with people, and they would say, oh, well, everyone, the Irish are, there's all this terrorism from Irish nationalism, and I had friends who lived in Belfast. So the two questions are that have to do with the difference between the two experiences in, say, the 70s and 80s, and whether you think Arab Americans might end up back in the Republican Party.
Do I need to speak into the mic?
Yes, you do. And then I'll play game show host.
There you go. Thanks, yes. Let me take your first question first. I don't think it's permanent, the support for the Democratic Party, but I also worry about the direction of the Republican Party, and I think that right now Republicans are worried about the direction of the Republican Party. So Arab American Republicans tend to be moderate, and I think that's the fear is that the moderate wing of the Republican Party is starting to be edged out, and I don't know if there's a place in the Tea Party version of the Republican Party for ethnic Americans of any kind, because it tends to not be very tolerant, and so I don't know. It really depends on the direction of the Republican Party. If it goes back to being the party of George Bush Sr., then I think yes, definitely there's a lot of support for that. But I'm a little concerned about the direction the Republican Party is going in. In terms of the terrorism label and why it's stuck, I think if we read Edward Said's book on Orientalism, that really tells it all, and that is that Arab and Muslim culture has been painted in the West as foreign and other, and something that is never really going to be accepted as part of a universal narrative. There's always, there's often going to be that assumption that if you come from that part of the world, there's something very different about you. And I think that the history of centuries of Orientalism has allowed those stereotypes to stick, whereas Irish, Northern European, that's what America was founded on, and Irish people look like normal Americans, they look like everybody else. And so I think that there is a racial quality to it, for sure, and there's the
Thank you very much for your informative talk. I'm sure we can all agree that it's terrible to inflict upon Arab Americans a whiff of what black people have been putting up with for 3 centuries. I remember, though, back in 1967 when SNCC, the first national organization, came out and condemned Israel at the time of the 1967 war. And several years later, when the League of Revolutionary Black Workers made conscious efforts to reach out to the Arab Americans in Detroit, Dearborn, in that whole area. And I wonder, have there been any reciprocal, that is to support Arabs, have there been any efforts that you're aware of among organized Arab American opinion in the United States to support the black struggle?
Well, I think I referred to that a little bit in the Rainbow Coalition experience of the Jesse Jackson campaigns of the 84 and 80, that this is more in a political and more of a mainstream political discourse. The number of Arab American progressives is less, obviously, than in the black community, for sure. But I think that those who are already in that political, ideological camp are typically very, very supportive of racial justice issues throughout the United States. I think that there is, that's why, but it's not been strong enough and it's not been long enough. And we, as a political constituency, we are more in our infancy. And I think that we just haven't had the same experience of organized political activity. And frankly, there is a strong conservative, I think, strain in the Arab community, in the Arab experience. But that's not to say that, and what I see, which is an interesting phenomenon, is I see in the current generation of college-age students, is that the students of color movements on campuses are very inclusive, and black students and Latino students, Asian students, and Middle Eastern students are often on the same page on many issues, particularly when it has to do with a racial justice issue. Where you find some cleavage is in something like immigration. Sometimes there will be, not all African American organizations are are necessarily on board with all issues of immigration reform. There are some other cleavages on other issues too. But by and large, I think there's a sympathy in the Arab American community. There's a sympathy for the African American experience. And frankly, in my work, we could not have achieved anything had it not been for the struggle, the civil rights struggle, because all of the laws that were put in place in the 1960s and 70s protecting against civil rights violations were a result of that struggle. And so we know that we have inherited an amazing legacy from the African American community. And I think that while we've had some support and some gestures of support, it's maybe not been enough.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Are you able to generalize about Arab American opinion or about the activity of the organization that you work with, that is, its response to the current, say, the Arizona question or the whole border? We're against walls in Jerusalem. Are we also against them in Arizona?
Thank you. We haven't done any surveys, so I can only tell you about what our organization is doing. And yeah, we are definitely on board with challenging the Arizona measure. And our biggest concern was that there was momentum in the Obama administration for some version of immigration reform, mostly as a result of what happened in Arizona. And then from what I'm being told by the people who work on the Hill, it's been derailed. And so that's unfortunate, because there was a little kind of window of momentum that we thought the administration and the Democratic leadership was going in that direction, and it looks now like they're dropping it. That's what I'm being told. Our position is that we see it as a domino effect. We know that other states, there's like 10 other states that are already going to put into effect measures that allow police to stop, it's basically racial profiling, stop people who look like they could be undocumented. We had a conference call. It's interesting to show you the diversity of political opinion in the Arab community, and that is that there are 4 state legislators in Arizona of Arab descent. I didn't know that until last month. 2 of them voted for the measure, 2 of them voted against the measure. And we asked those who voted against the measure, we had a conference call with them last week, and we asked them about, well, why would Joe Hill, whatever his name was, vote for that measure? And he said because of his constituency. He lives in a whatever, very white, middle class, district, and that's what his people want, basically. And the problem is that in Arizona, the opinion polls are like 80% in favor of that, which is very devastating. But it goes to show you that even in our small little ethnic community, there are 2 who voted for and 2 who voted against.
Thank you. I was wondering about complexities of deciding how to organize and the choice of using the word Arab. And I know the complexity of what the word means here. For instance, Jewish people can be Arabs. They are Arabs, they were Arabs. Some of them now live in the U.S. I wonder if any of them are a member of your organization. The other thing I wonder about is, John Esposito spoke here earlier this year, and of course he's doing a similar kind of thing, trying to organize around the concept of Muslim discrimination and other areas, and that obviously overlaps, but then it includes all sorts of other people that you can't include when you use the word Arab. And so I'm wondering, and we have a peculiar situation that the Arab American community is a strange selection from the Arab world because of the timing, and it hardly represents, in religious terms, the rest of the Arab world. And therefore I wonder about, the roots of its conservatism and how that is an artifact of how selective a group it is.
Well, to take your last point first, I think that the roots of the conservatism probably has to do with the propensity to be small business owners, to not, to be self-employed. I think that conservatism often, there's 2 really trends, I think. One is fiscally conservative, and the other is socially conservative. I think Muslims for sure are conservative. In most polling that we do, American Muslims are quite conservative in social issues. And I think that kind of those 2 things overlap. And Arab Christians tend to be conservative. They can be very conservative, but it's so hard to generalize. You saw the polling, and when you contrast it with other communities, yeah, we come out a little bit on the conservative side, but some of the most vocal voices, the vocal leadership in our community are on the progressive side. It's very broad. Remind me now of the first part of your question. Oh, about the term Arab. The Arab American identity is kind of an invention that really happened about 35 years ago. There were a lot of organizations in the States that were in the 60s and 70s was a reflection of Arab nationalist ideology, basically, that we're all Arabs and that was very, very prominent in the 1960s. What we did in the 1980s is we sort of took that and applied it to an American political model like the Latino community. There's no such thing as Latinos outside of the United States. They don't exist. People always have multiple identities. They are Chicano and Latino, they are Puerto Rican and Latino, and Latino became, and Asian American is another example. They are constructs in the American political environment. They don't exist outside. Although in the case of the Arab experience, there are Arab entities. There's the Arab League, for example, and there are a lot of organizations that take the Arab world. So in a sense, we have a formula that we're building on, whereas in many other, ethnic communities, they don't really have a formula. When we identify as Arab Americans, we say we are a secular community. This is a secular identity. It is not religious, and it is not even racial, because Arabs can be Sudanese, and they can be Lebanese, and they can be anything. So it's not racial, and it's not religious. It is a geographic, cultural, linguistic-based identity. And we get all the crazy emails you can imagine. Like, we have so many things on our website, Arab Americans making a difference, and we have famous people in there. And so Paula Abdul is an example. I guess her dad is a Syrian Jew, and we always ask people, would you like to be in our publication? She said, sure, absolutely, I'm fine with that. So it all depends on the person, I think. And we get, Paula Abdul is a Jew, she's not an Arab. And we have our whole response, which is, it is not a religious affiliation, it is not a religious identity, it is not a racial identity, it is a cultural identity. Now, to be honest, most Arab Jews in the United States don't identify as Arabs. Their Jewish identity is much stronger. Now, they have all their own institutions. The Sephardic Jews have so many of their own institutions that they don't need or want, frankly, an identity with the Arab community. And I think it's largely political, but it's also cultural and religious. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they wouldn't want to do that. But we kind of set a frame around this identity and said, we are secular, and it's true that there's a lot of overlap with issues affecting Muslims. It's also true that the majority of immigrants from the Arab world are Muslim, counter to the earlier wave. But the majority of American Muslims are not Arab, just like the majority of Muslims worldwide are not Arab. So there's like a convenient conflation in the minds of newspaper editors and headline writers and frankly, people in the administration and in government positions. They conflate Arab and Muslim all the time. And we are constantly correcting them. But we also know that in the real world, a lot of these issues overlap. So when someone says something that's Islamophobic or that is trashing Islam, we know that the roots of that can be found everywhere. They can be found in the Arab narrative. They can be found in the Islamic extremist narrative. I mean, everywhere. So what we do is we identify as Arab in the secular sense, but we cooperate and collaborate with Muslim organizations. You mentioned John Esposito. Isn't his center Muslim Christian understanding? Okay, that is actually a very different framework than what we do, because we're an ethnic constituency and his is an academic center. And I think that they're trying to study the linkages basically between the Christian and Muslim heritages and experiences. Yeah.
Do we have more questions?
Quick.
Thank you.
I'm just curious about the phenomenon of, the earlier wave would tend to be conservative, would tend to perhaps even see themselves, basically the Christians, as minorities, in a sense fleeing. Is this changing amongst those people? I mean, has there been a consciousness change amongst that people? Have they related to the new situation, to all this, or is there still this compartmentalization? And the second part of it is there any targeting of university people in your work. Now there's the mission of John Esposito, this academic, but in your work is in targeting of the university people and what's happening with young people there. Are they sort of wanting to get into the Western thing and sort of melt into America, or are they becoming sort of a source of of balancing the whole vision of things?
Thank you.
I think that there has been an evolution of the identity issue among the descendants of the early wave of immigrants, because you're right, when they came, like when my grandparents came, they didn't refer to themselves as Arabs. They spoke Arabic, but they were either Wulad Shem, or they were from a certain village or city or something, but they didn't refer to themselves as Arabs. And that is changing. I think to some extent I hope it's a function of some of the organizing that we've done in institutions. There are some communities that are resistant to the Arab identity. I'll be very honest with you. There are some religious minority communities that have come from the Middle East who are very uncomfortable with Arab identity and reject it. And we hear often from them that, when we do statistical analysis, don't count us with you. And that occurs mostly with certain parts of the Maronite community, although not all. The Chaldean and Assyrian communities from Iraq, the Coptic community from Egypt. So, but it's not universal. It is not universal. And often, I think what we find is that when there's a critical mass, the resistance is there. When there's no critical mass and someone is living by themselves in some small town out in Iowa, they're happy to be Arab because they want some. They often need company when things don't go well, or when they need to find what food to buy or things like that. But what I have found is, despite the resistant minority communities, I think that there has been an interesting evolution of identity over the decades. And I think that part of it is a settling in, a sense of arrival and establishment of comfort levels and security. If you've been here already for 3 generations, you don't have a whole lot to worry about. So it's not, some people are actually fine with, they sometimes their pride in their heritage trumps politics. Not always, but sometimes it does. And I've seen that all throughout my dealings with this community. When you go to the small town in some small southern town in southern state, and you call up and you say, well, we're from the Arab American Institute. They might never have called themselves Arab before, ever. And we understand you're running for mayor, and we have we do political work, and we'd like to know if we can help you in any way. And then one thing leads to the other, and then they find out that someone that they know, and it's an amazing kind of connection of dots and when you get them together when you get the third generation together with the immigrant generation, the current immigrant generation, it's fascinating to see what they teach each other, because the third generation have American down pat. They understand what it is to be red, white, and blue, and they have all of that whole narrative. And what they're looking for is reconnecting with their roots. And then the immigrants love the fact that these people are mayors and city councilmen, and they're respected, and it's an interesting kind of 2 wings of the community.
Maybe we'll take one more question. Do we have another question? Yes? No? No?
Well, I could make one.
Thank you.
I find this very interesting because I grew up in America. I lived there for half of the century you're talking about. And I lived in the Iowa town that you're talking about too. But I also lived in New York and Wisconsin and Minnesota and several other states. But I have not lived there in the last 10 years. So I have not seen what's happened since 9/11. But the 50 years I did live there, we never paid any attention to where or what nationalities anybody was. We had mild interest from time to time. Oh, you know, you're Jewish. Oh, and hell, I'm part American Indian. So, you know, we're all immigrants in America. All of us. You're an immigrant, and we're all melting in together. How many Americans are here? Okay, a lot of us. You know, and you know, I don't care whether people know that I'm Irish, which I am. I don't care whether they know I'm English or American Indian or whatever. And I never saw any of the discrimination that you're talking about. And I just kind of feel like it must be a backlash from 9/11 and the problems of the Muslims you don't want to be associated with as an Arab. And I can appreciate that. But the Japanese went through the same thing in World War II. And this will be over. This will be gone in another decade. And we'll all live through it. And we'll all be happy immigrants together in the future. So I hope you're not giving the impression to these people that there's been this continuing struggle of Arabs for the last century, because I never saw it. Or maybe I was blind to it growing up in Iowa. So I just wanted to show that. I just wanted to bring that out as you know, this isn't a crisis here.
I mean, do others feel the same way I'm talking like?
No,
Do you
I
feel
don't.
there's
No, I